new audience spectrum. So just to remind everybody, audience spectrum is a segmentation of the UK population, really based on their cultural habits, and importantly, it's geolocatable, so we can see in which postcodes people with tendencies to have interest in different kinds of culture actually live. There are 10 segments altogether in audience spectrum, and originally we built the first version of audience spectrum, I think around about, I think we were launching it around about nearly 9 years ago. So we've now decided, with so much more data at our fingertips than we had in the first place, to give it a really good refresh. So one of the things that we heard from all of our users is they wanted much greater granularity. If you're using audience spectrum in a very practical way, you'll know that actually it's really useful to have some differentiation, some more detail. So one of the reasons we have made these updates is on your request to provide some greater granularity. Secondly, we really noticed, we work with literally hundreds of organisations on audience spectrum every year, and one of the things that we've discovered is that for some organisations in particular parts of the country, or for particular kinds of work, we'll find that they have, just one or two dominant segments, and it's useful for them to have more detail to help in their work. We also know that people are much more used to using segmentation in their work. It's become much more prevalent in the way that we develop audiences and market culture in general. And so actually we wanted to have a tool that was more able to fit around your own segmentation as well. And I think there's lots of good new benefits in the enhanced version of Audience Spectrum will help you to do that. And of course, there have been lots of changes in the environment, particularly in audience behaviours. Obviously, lots of that been quite COVID driven, and some of the changes that we've seen post-COVID also have affected how we've built some of the observations in the segmentation. And of course, there's also been changes in what culture is available and so on. We've also learnt an awful lot over the past decade of using Audience Spectrum, particularly working really closely with organisations. So we've got a better idea now of how people really use it, and that's been uppermost in our minds as we thought about rebuilding. Yeah, there's a question from Joe Nancaro here saying, what is granularity? I have to say it's one of those words that I overuse with great enthusiasm, but it's a bit of a buzzwordy jargon, isn't it? But granularity, in other words, there are more grains in it, so it just basically more detail. Thank you for that. Keep us on track. And yeah, so we now sit on these amazing, we look after these amazing, huge data sets now about audiences all over the country that we derive from a number of different ways, from the Audience Finder program that some of you will be involved in. But we have literally millions of records telling us what audiences do around the country. And we wanted to make sure we were folding back a lot of that intel and new knowledge into the enhanced version of Audience Spectrum. So there's some of that in there as well. We've also been we've got this millions of survey responses. I think it is over 1 million survey responses to the Audience Finder survey question, which tells us to think about things like motivations and so on. So again, a really big data set there. We wanted to make sure that all the value of that was folded back into Audience Spectrum too. And we also have got some interesting new data sets at our fingertips. So we've always used the Department for Culture, Media and Sports Taking Part survey as an important layer in the segmentation. But we've now got things like the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is the population survey we've been running since 2020. We now have a really important new source of data there, which is very much more about sort of how audiences are feeling about things right now. And the idea is that we can try and fold some of that more current information into Audience Spectrum too. So that's the kind of the why and the why now thinking. Ollie, please, could you keep an eye on the chat? If anybody's asking us for any clarifying questions as we go through, would you just flag those to me? So do please put your questions in there, and Ollie can just flag those to me, and I'll do the same for him in a moment. So to move on, what next?
There is, in fact, a question right there, which is there an Audience Spectrum classifier tool so where you can list a postcode and see the segment breakdown of that data set?
Would you like to answer that, Ollie, while we're there?
Yes, why not? So certainly at present, there isn't a kind of external place you can just drop data like that, but you can do profiling through us if you come to us, which is a paid for service. Or if you're putting data through something like Audience Finder, it's there available for free.
Yeah, so there's not somewhere that we've always been a little bit resistant to just dumping postcodes into a profiler on the grounds that it's quite important to know which postcodes you're looking at and how relevant they are. But if you're an audience finder, you do get automatic profiling of your all of your data. So that's the way that we do that. So it's a good question though. And by the way, if you've got suggestions and things that you'd like the sound of, or you'd like more of, or you'd like less of, please, this is a really great chance to let us know about those things as well as we go. Right, Ollie, next slide, please. So what are the new subsegments? So one of the really important new aspects of audience spectrum, we wanted to add that extra layer of detail, and we ummed and ahed for ages about just adding some new segments to the existing ones, and then decided, for the sake of managing to maintain the known framework of audience spectrum that many of us are used to using, the easiest thing to do would be to take the existing 10 segments and simply split those into two. So there's some other segmentation systems that work in a similar way. So we now have 10 top line segments that are all now split into two subsegments as per that nicely simple diagram there. And the way in which we did the split was based primarily on engagement levels and booking behavior. So audience spectrum always looks at is graded from super engagers at one end of the spectrum to people that very rarely engage at the other, and they are listed 1 to 10 in that way. And we've continued to do that for these subsegments. So actually they're split. So segment 1 will be the slightly more engaged of the two subsegments in each case. There are also significant differences between each of the subsegments. Geography is another key aspect, and we'll see that as we look at some of the segments themselves. The demographics are different between the two segments. As subsegments, that's an important qualifier as well. And also, as I say, we have drawn out particular factors that we know you find particularly useful and interesting, like the kind of things that people might be interested in doing and so on. So we've also drawn out things which are particular points of interest in terms of the practical uses of audience spectrum. Ollie, would you say that's a hierarchy? That was the way in which we prioritise the breakdown of segments?
Yes. So obviously our priority is always about cultural engagement, which is obviously how they were initially defined. But yes, some of the other factors come in, particularly for segments where there's lower levels of engagement. Some of those other factors come into play more. Whereas obviously there's lots of engagement, we can differentiate between not only levels, but also types of things people are doing. So some segments doing a lot more in terms of family events, and others doing more in terms of maybe more traditional sitting down culture, the so-called.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Just think it's just useful to understand, when you're looking, if you're used to looking at the 10 segments, you suddenly go, I've got these new subsegments. It's really useful to understand the basis on which they have been subbed or divided, basically. So engagement levels first, but then these other factors come in further down the chain. Okay, next slide. So what's new? As we've just said, the layer of subsegments is important, and of course this is really about being able to differentiate more between different kinds of audiences, particularly if you're an area that's dominated by one or two types, or indeed that they dominate your audience in particular. We've also thought quite a lot about how people use audience spectrum, as I've said, and thought quite a lot about the practical applications of it. So we've been thinking more about, well, how might we change our actions to support or to be of interest to people in different groups. And we've also thought quite a lot about enhancing the resources that we make available to you to use. Now, we're only part way through that process at the moment. So we're now building up a lot of resources, as I will explain later on. So if you've got things that you would find particularly useful and interesting in terms of support resources around this, do please let us know. And as we've said, we also know there are a number of themes that have become particularly important. We've already mentioned, significant changes to audience behaviour that have been driven by lockdown and COVID. Digital engagement, of course, has changed quite radically in the time that, since we've been using audience spectrum. We were very keen to try to demonstrate some of those, to reflect some of those kind of key themes, the different, big trends and changes in how audiences behave. Next one, Ollie. So you'll see specifically in the way that audience spectrum looks that we've updated the icons, so it's a little bit easier to work out which one's which. We have, importantly, completely renamed 2 of the top level segments. So what used to be called Facebook families, slightly misleadingly, it turned out over time, because Facebook has turned out to be quite a middle-class sport, I understand, and Facebook families aren't particularly. So we've now renamed Facebook families to frontline families, and I believe that one of the key factors in doing that is that a lot of people in that group are actually frontline workers of one kind or another, and also perhaps, very much, perhaps really badly affected by cost of living crisis and so on. So we've called that group more accurately, I believe, frontline families. And the other group we've renamed is another less engaged group that was formerly called Heydays, which had this whiff of older people around it, which we've now renamed supported communities, particularly because the Heydays, we always had this issue that in the Heydays groupings, which the Heydays group rather, which actually includes a lot of people that are living in supported living, whether that's living in care or living in sort of community living one way or another, but it also included lots of younger people as well. So you've got this real split between quite young people and people who are older people in care. So now we've given that a better name, supported communities, which again is sort of more accurately says what's really going on there. You'll see that we've revamped the presentation of the pen portraits and hopefully made it a little bit easier to navigate, especially with more detail in there. And we've expanded it, as I said. So each of the 10 segments, as you know, has 2 subsegments, and they're very easily renamed, just M1 and M2 for metroculturals, S1 and S2 for supported communities, just to keep it simple, so we haven't got a proliferation of kind of crazy names. Ollie, we're nearly there. I think we are. Next slide, please. Oh, I think I need to have to say importantly, just to reassure you, so therefore, you will still recognize most of the names. It shouldn't come as a horrible shock. We had lots of feedback from people saying, please don't mess with the names. It makes life so difficult. So, although there are some variations of borders and so on, broadly speaking, we've built on the existing structure rather than messed around with it.
And just to spell out that last point, that means that anyone that was in one of the existing top tier segments is still in that segment.
Thank you. Important.
So people haven't moved between top tier segments. We've only subdivided within those segments.
Exactly. So it won't make inaccurate work that you already have ongoing. Okay, great. Thank you. So here they are. You'll be glad to know that I am not going to walk you through all of the segments. Some important things, as we know, metroculturals, particularly if you're in a large urban centre, brackets, particularly if you're in London, metroculturals are enormously important audience. It's worth saying that there are some differences, particularly between these are super engagers, but there are some quite interesting differences between the sort of older and more established professional elites and this kind of a younger group of more metropolitan kind of professionals with some significant different preferences and habits in terms of culture. Again, very important group for some of us. Quite a lot of people's audiences will be dominated either by commuter land culture buffs or by experience seekers. Commuter land culture buffs being that sort of older, quite affluent, leafy suburbs kind of audience. But here we see that there's a big difference between sort of suburban and urban audiences, which should be quite interesting. And again, that younger experience seekers group, really important because they're a bit of a signifier about what tomorrow's audiences might look like. We've sort of split again, it's I think quite a lot of this by age. So you've got a slightly older, more midlife, kind of millennials grouping under E1, whereas E2 are still are very much in that sort of younger, backpacking, still studenty kind of grouping. So quite important again in terms of behaviours and likely interests. Moving on to our middle engaged group. So those are the high engaged groups. Here are the middle engaged groups. Some of you will have audiences very much dominated by dormitory dependables, and I know my colleague Catherine, who spends a lot of time with organisations, is thrilled that she's not showing people now saying, oh, you've got a lot of dormitory dependables. She's able to give people some clues about some differences between that large group. So dormitory dependables, sort of quite interesting culture, not necessarily hugely adventurous, but again, we're seeing some differences between the more kind of you know, more suburban, dormitory dependable, slightly different habits perhaps from those who are living much further away from big cities. So that's an interesting one there. Trips and treats, a family audience, again, really interesting, two different kinds of family groupings there really. And similarly, home and heritage can be a very large group for some people. Again, geography, quite an important signifier for those differences between home and heritage, I believe. Lots to look at here. As you know, you can see I'm whisking through this very, very quickly, but what I'm suggesting is that I'm hoping this is a taster and encouraging you a small breadcrumb trail towards going and having a look at some of this stuff on the website and getting to grips with it. And if you've got questions, this is much more interesting to hear from you what's interesting rather than me rambling on at you. So again, the less engaged groups, 4 of those split out, 2 different names here, the frontline families and supported communities, as we've said. Some interesting differences there that we're going to have a look at, I think particularly closed circuit creativity, Ollie will be talking about in a moment. Very importantly in London, this is a very dominant group for quite a lot of organisations, so important here for us to have split those out. As I say, again, really interestingly, we've seen this is helping us to understand quite a lot about the different makeup, both demographically, but also in terms of cultural interests. So flipping on then to, I think this is our last slide, just looking what the country looks like, I believe. So if we're profiling the nation using Audience Spectrum, this is what it looks like. Essentially, you can see that they do break down quite well, so that actually we're getting good coverage of each of the groups across the country. Ollie, anything you'd want to comment on there about just the national profile?
I guess to note that although it's splitting most groups, roughly speaking, into half, some of the groups, some of the subgroups are bigger than others, which is worth being conscious of. We talked about, well, you talked about that supported communities little group of much younger people, and you can see that that's the kind of 2% on the far right end there. So most of that segment is still as one substantial minority. So,
yeah, really important to say. So, and don't forget, although we're looking at a national profile here, you can be looking at these overall profiles for regions, the town you live in, so you can look at this kind of the overall picture. You can look at for any area. Come and talk to us about how to do that. Okay, I think I'm gone. Ollie, I can see you about to say something.
I was just going to give a little plug to our place events, just to say that we are, of course, doing that for various different places around the country as well as part of that ongoing series. But yeah,
that's right, actually. So we've been doing a series of so-called place events where we're looking at, what does the background population of this area looks like? What does that mean for the way organisations might work together? If you're interested in us coming to your area to do that, let us know, because we're following the interest, as it were, on that one. Okay, and that's free, by the way. I think that's subsidised by that's fully funded by the Arts Council. So when I say that, I mean it's like call us rather than pay us. Okay, so I think we're now going to move on. I'm going to check. I'm going to keep my eye on questions if there's anything you'd like clarifying. But we're going to keep moving on so that we can get to a property conversation at the end of this. And I'm going to hand over to Ollie, who's really going to think about how can we apply these new enhanced version of Audience Spectrum.
Great, thank you. So yes, I thought it would be useful for us to talk through a few different examples to kind of look at different ways of where the subsegments might kind of add granularity, as previously mentioned, add nuance, add extra kind of insights and information to what we're looking at. And I've picked a few different examples that are deliberately quite different from each other. They're by no means everything that can be done with them, but I thought it would at least give a bit of a sense of range. So we'll partly be looking at applying the segments to survey data, to ticketing data, to population data of various sorts at different scales, but also looking at different ways of differentiating between, let's say, different programs or different venues, looking at change over time, looking at overall sweeps of large areas, looking at how to really sort of, if you like, differentiate smaller areas where there's been, it's previously been a bit trickier to do that. So we would also, of course, love to hear from you as and when you have examples where you've used it. So, do please, anyone, either obviously today, if anyone's really ahead of the curve, or later on, please do share with us what you found and what you've seen. So to start with, the first example I'm going to pick is one which is an organisation which is very dear to my heart, being very based locally, and indeed my first employer, Sheffield Museums. And For this example, we looked, because Sheffield Museums have had a great track record of collecting lots of audience finder survey data. They've got a really big pool of data to have a look at. So we use that to look at some of the survey data, and particularly to zoom in on one of the segments. So a big chunk of Sheffield Museums audience is experience seekers. 1 in 5 of their visitors, roughly speaking, which means that that segment is big enough that it's usable, but there's room to differentiate within it. So what we did is we tagged the survey responses with the audience spectrum types, and then kind of did some various analysis based on that. From that, we could see that there were some substantial differences between the subsegments that sat underneath the overall experience seeker label. And I know there are at least a few Sheffielders in the room who will recognise some of the dynamics going on here. So, as Anne mentioned, broadly speaking, under experience seekers, we've got the kind of a mix between the slightly older E1 group and the slightly kind of younger, earlier career or still student E2 group. And when we started to look at what that meant in terms of the audience for Sheffield Museums, a few different things came out. So, typically speaking, across the different sites that the museums have, they have the Western Park Museum, which is kind of city museum with a strong kind of family angle outside the centre. There's the Graves Art Gallery, which is a kind of visual art space, which is at the top of the library. So it takes you have to go up a few stairs or take the lift to get to that one. But then there's the Millennium Gallery, which is a really kind of big, popular thoroughfare near the station, and Kelham Island Museum, as part of the recent merger with Sheffield Industrial Museums Trust and Museum Sheffield. And what we found was that the E1 group, the older group, who again were slightly more settled into life in the city maybe, were more likely to be previous visitors. They've probably been around a bit longer in the city, they've had more chance to see things, they've probably got more of an ongoing engagement with the kind of city and its history, and they're more likely to have families, and they're more likely to be taking those to things like Western Park Museum. So we saw a bit of a skew towards previous visitors amongst that group, whereas the E2 group were much more likely to be new visitors. And if they had been, they were recent new visitors. There were fewer people saying, we've been before, but it was 5 years ago. It was very much sort of on the newer end. Similarly, who they attend with varies. So both groups were both types were both likely to attend in groups. So they're likely to attend with other people, but those groups skewed towards attending with children for E1 and attending with other adults for E2. And interestingly, although E1 were more likely to have been to the Graves Art Gallery, E2 were more likely to attend in groups there. So again, it suggests maybe a bit of a shift where maybe people are exploring together with friends, as opposed to sort of, I don't know, maybe long-term habitual visitors making these kind of solo trips. So we saw that kind of very much a difference in behaviour, and linked to that, we saw quite a difference in terms of where people lived. So we could separate out between local and non-local members of experience seekers. So we looked just at Sheffield postcodes, and within those, there was quite a heavy concentration in the E1 group, in areas called S6, S7 and S8, which are kind of like middle-class suburbs, lots of families arranged around the centre of the city. Whereas the other group, with more students, there were lots in the centre and in S10, again near Hallam and Sheffield University. So very much linked to that kind of profile in terms of being students and graduates. So what that gives us within this wider and really key group, the experience seekers, a real sense that there is differentiation in terms of motivations, in terms of interest, in terms of content they're interested, where they live, what they do, and therefore with targeted promotions or targeting particular offers to people, there are different places to look, different places to go, different things they might be looking for, and all of those can be targeted just that little bit sharper by using the second tier down. I know that Gemma from Sheffield Museums is here, so maybe if this comes up again in the chat when we have the Q&A later, if people have questions, then I'm sure Gemma will be more of an authority than me in terms of some of these things. But yes, so that was a little overview in terms of this use for Sheffield Museums. Next example is Chichester Festival Theatre. So here, although obviously using ticketing data, we normally get these huge tranches of data to analyse, we've really zoomed in on one particular factor. So here we're looking just again at one particular segment and its subsegments and what's changed. But in this instance, we're looking at what's changed over time. So Chichester Festival Theatre, for those who don't know, is based on the South Coast, and it's a very large venue, quite broad reach. But typically speaking, as per most non-London venues, metroculturals are, they're not insignificant, but they're not a huge part of the audience because they're so concentrated in London. So typically you'd see maybe sort of 3-4% of the audience being metroculturals. And that was the case pre-COVID. Now the story that we've seen play out in lots of different ways through the population monitor, through analysing various different venues data, is that there was a shift during COVID in terms of the mixture of people who were most comfortable attending or most frequently. And typically we saw that people being really highly engaged, urban-based, and being young were three of the key factors that tended to drive attendance up. And sure enough, with metroculturals often fitting a lot of that profile, particularly in terms of high engagement, high attendance, they tended to spike in terms of proportion of engagement during the pandemic. Not in absolute numbers, but in terms of within the mix of people attending, that went up substantially. And indeed, it did here for Chichester. So that far is not very surprising. We would expect to see it, we did see it, all good. What I think is potentially a bit more interesting once we can look at these subsegments is to see the pattern that played out between those two subsegments. So as Anne mentioned, you've got sort of the older, more established, more affluent M1 group, the younger M2 group, sort of earlier in career, etc. And typically the M1 would attend more than M2. And that indeed was the case before. So that roughly double the proportion of the attenders were from M1 than M2. And both of these groups grew during COVID. So they both went up, they both followed the same kind of pattern. They're both highly engaged, they're both urban, makes sense. But notably, the M2 group grew faster. So from being about half the proportion, it ended up even higher than the M1 group in terms of the mix of people attending. And although it's fallen away again a bit as a wider range of people have been going out and engaging, you can still see the levels are relatively elevated. We'll see how that plays out over time as the other segments come through. But this kind of flip between the prominence of the two subsegments tells us something interesting about that particular moment in time and who is prepared to do what and engage where. And the thing I think that makes it really stark is if you look at the whole list of 20 subsegments, the M2 subsegment was the third lowest in 1819, and it was the third highest in 2021. So it really shot up in terms of relative prominence because of that period. Now, of course, we're hoping that the kind of extreme peak of COVID that we've seen in recent years hopefully isn't going to recur to quite the same degree. But hopefully this is illustrative that in a wide range of other contexts where you see really substantial change and variation in programming, in the same opening a new venue or trying something really radically different, you might see bigger changes among subsegments than you see among segments overall, or you might see very particular subsegments responding, and you may be able to see patterns in terms of which subsegments all respond in the same way, to give more clues about which audiences are reacting to what. So that's kind of an illustration really about how a particular moment in time can see changes in particular subsegments. I've seen a couple of things in the chat. Is there anything worth flagging, Anne?
Nothing I've seen recently that's particularly relevant to this bit, Ollie, all right?
That's fine, okay. Yeah, so that was our second example. So we're taking a little bit of a tour around the country. We're going to up north again. Well, not just up north. We're going to look at this, if you like, government buzzword, levelling up, which we've obviously heard loads about, and that's affecting transport infrastructure and all sorts of different bits of the economy, but it also linked to culture, and every local authority in the country has been allocated against one of three kind of categories of priority in terms of levelling up. So there's category 1, which is high priority, 2, medium priority, and 3, you guessed it, lower priority. And we can see where all of these are across the country. So, large patches of Wales across the north, the borders, either side of the borders, and indeed the the Kentish coast are all kind of in these high priority areas. Large swathes of the south, perhaps unsurprisingly, are in the lower priority band. And if we look at the population in each of those three tiers, unsurprisingly, yes, there's lots of variety because lots of different people live in lots of different places. But broadly speaking, there are more people in lower engaged, or typically lower engaged segments in the high priority areas than there are in the low priority areas. And this is probably one of those things you think, well, that's incredibly obvious. It's really, it's not that surprising, it's not that interesting. I would agree. What I think is more interesting is when we start looking at that really properly split out, looking at these subsegments. So here we have the proportion of people in each subsegment within each of those three bands. So just to take an example, looking at the far left, Metrocultural's M1, there's a very, very small proportion of them in the high priority areas, as you'd expect. There's slightly more, but still not loads, in the medium priority, and then there's slightly more, but really not that much more in the lowest priority area. So you see those kind of three little bars on the left, and that same picture is then repeated across the whole chart. So you can see there's quite a variety going on, but most interestingly, if we zoom in, looking at lower engaged groups, we see an odd pattern amongst these two groups in particular. So that's what we're going to zoom in on, the upper street and frontline families. So, although we've seen a broad pattern towards lower engaged groups being more represented in the priority areas, hence these solid bars being highest compared to the sort of hatched and pale ones, there's a substantial difference between the subsegments. So up our street is split into two groups, one which tends to be a bit more middle-aged, more like kind of semis on the edge of town, and the other one which is more like older terraces and flats in sort of more built-up areas. And of those two, the latter is much more likely to be overrepresented in levelling up areas. So there's a really big concentration. For the U1 group, they're really only marginally overrepresented at all compared to category 2 of the sort of medium priority. They're massively overrepresented for the older group. The flip side of that is that the frontline families, the younger group, who tends to be more financially hard pressed and to be younger, they tend to be either new families or couples sort of heading towards starting families, as opposed to the kind of older, slightly more established families. It's the younger group who are much more overrepresented amongst the levelling up areas. So if you're looking to program work in these areas in particular, or you're trying to understand behaviours in these areas in particular, it's more helpful to be looking at the subsegments and see the very particular behaviours and interests and patterns and comms preferences and profile and so forth of the subsegments, rather than just looking at the aggregate kind of, this is what up our street in general are like, because these subsegments are much more represented in that particular area. So hopefully that all makes sense. So that's the levelling up example. I'm now going to zoom back down the other end of the country and to look at London in particular. And although I'm looking at London, this will apply in different ways to other places, but we have known from lots of conversations with people using Audience Spectrum that Audience Spectrum at the top tier in London has created some particular challenges that have necessitated some sort of various creative responses in the past in terms of different ways to break down the segments to kind of get more granularity. And the reason for that is this. If we look at the overall audience spectrum profile, the top tier for London, 75% of the population are in those three key segments. So kaleidoscope creativity, metroculturals, experience seekers. So getting on for a third in each of those top two. Which obviously then makes it quite difficult to be granular with that unless you start introducing other factors. It also means that the picture across the whole of London, when you apply that, gets a little bit less nuanced than perhaps we would want. So what we're looking at here is just zooming in on the kaleidoscope creativity and looking at how looking at the two subtypes of that particular segment gives us a more nuanced picture of London as a whole. And we're doing that in this instance by looking at the profile of the boroughs. Of course, again, all this information can be looked at by region, by local authority or borough, by ward, by postcode sector, whatever. But in this instance, we'll stick to something nice and clear at the borough level. So, just to explain what will, on the face of it, look like a sort of slightly complex chart. It's not as bad as it looks, I promise. Broadly speaking, we've put every borough in London on this one chart, and the higher up they are on this one axis, the higher the proportion of kaleidoscope creativity there are within that borough overall. So you can see Newham is far and away the highest, with getting on at something like 67% within kaleidoscope creativity. And right at the bottom end, you can see Havering down there with very few indeed, about 3%. So they're sort of stretched out on that dimension. We've also then stretched them out on the opposite dimension, which is to say, of the kaleidoscope creativity that are in that borough, are there more of them who tend to be in K1, or are there more of them that tend to be in K2? So the more extreme the balance between those, the further away from that central line they'll be. So you can see here, for example, Kensington and Chelsea has relatively few kaleidoscope creativity at all. When it does have them, they're overwhelmingly going to be the K1 type. Whereas if you look at Hillingdon in the middle on the right, you can see that actually there's a slightly higher proportion of them getting on for a third, but they're very predominantly the K2 type. So you can sort of see different types of places have different balances within the kaleidoscope creativity, as well as different volumes of them overall. Now, the third dimension we've played into this is to highlight the places where kaleidoscope creativity is the dominant segment. So it's the biggest single top tier segment for that borough, and those are the dark dots. And then the medium dots are where it's still quite a big part, you know, it's at least half of the whatever the highest one is. And then there's all the others where it's not such a big deal. So this is where, if you want to place your bets about where each of the London boroughs are, now's your chance to kind of predict your local one if you're a Londoner. And this is how it works out. So what we see is there's a really big cluster in the top right here. So generally speaking, if a borough has more kaleidoscope creativity than anything else, and really high levels of kaleidoscope creativity, generally speaking, it's the K2 type. If there are, the only exception to that, in fact, is Lewisham, which is the only place which has more kaleidoscope creativity than any other segment, but they skew the other way, and it's very marginal. It's pretty close to the centre line there. Then we have a couple of other little groupings. So in the east and south of the centre of London, we've got this pocket of sort of Hackney, Lambeth, Tower Hamlets, Southwark, where they're more likely to be the K1 group, but it's not the single largest group. In fact, there's lots of metroculturals around this particular area. And then conversely, Haringey, Merton, Barnet skew the other way. And then we've got quite a swathe elsewhere. But you can see that in some of these areas, there's really very few of the K2 types, even though there aren't that many kaleidoscope creativity overall. So that's the kind of, you know, Westminster, Hammersmith, Kensington, etc.
Ollie, we've just had a question from Bella, who said, can you just remind us what kaleidoscope creativity as an overall segment are like? So very particular, very urban segment, appears in lots of big cities, and
Yes, so they have a tendency to be more diverse in terms of ethnicities. There's a tendency to be a little bit younger than average, but often, so I mean, in a way, it's the sum of these two subgroups here. So you do get kind of pockets of people who've lived in particular places for quite a long time, but also then you have these kind of sort of younger singles, particularly in often it could be council blocks or it could be sort of rented accommodation. So it's a bit of a mix, but a strong urban skew.
And I think importantly, you know, they're a very important grouping for, you know, this is a type, a profile that appears in the audiences of quite a lot of organisations in large areas, and actually quite important in terms of sort of perhaps the social objectives to kind of be more accessible to a broader audience. So they're kind of an interesting group from that point of view. And the very, you know, in particular, we see lots of kaleidoscope creatives that coming to outdoor arts events, those kinds of things, local festivals and so on. So that just to give you a bit of flavour. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Ollie. There you go. In that sort of.
I'm always conscious when I talk about, you know, particularly about London audiences, that lots of my colleagues actually live and breathe it, as opposed to visiting occasionally. So the other thing to say actually about that group is that we've seen some quite interesting patterns in terms of digital engagement, some of the online engagement, that they've behaved a little bit more like some of the other highly engaged groups, or some of the higher engaged groups through those channels. So often they're often not engaging with the kind of subsidized arts sector, but are engaging in other ways potentially. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of interesting things about this group. So as much as I love a scatter plot, I've been led to believe that other people find other ways of visualizing stuff a little bit more straightforward. So let's just see where all these different groups are geographically. So these are the same categories we talked about before. So the bold ones are the darkest, the palest ones, obviously the ones that were at the bottom. And what we can see is very much a strong inner-outer London split. So more of the K1s in inner London, more of the K2s in outer London. But there's also clearly quite a strong east-west gradient as well, particularly the centre. So we get these kind of quite striking stripes, which is why Lewisham stuck out as that kind of real exception, because it's on the eastern end of that kind of central grouping, and indeed very, very close to that central line. What we also see is that once you get a certain distance out of central London, the proportion of this group drops very highly anyway. So there's many fewer in the southwest, there's many fewer in the east. You get much more into the kind of suburban segments when you go out that way. Nonetheless, we can see this kind of swirl around the outside of really sort of high concentration of that kind of the K2 group, the kind of younger group there. So what this would hopefully give us is a sort of a more varied sense of the geography of the place. So, you know, we've done Where's Work in London for years, but I think even so, I think once we saw this visualized, it started to give a nice sort of impression about what was going on with these segments. And we could do the equivalent thing for different places or different segments, indeed, even in the same place. So that's a range of these different examples, hopefully showing that you can do all sorts of different things with it, and pick up different aspects of how people are engaging, or who they are, or where they are, or so forth. So that was that from me. Yes, as I said before, we would love to hear your examples as and when you've had more of a chance to produce them.
We would, and actually, Ollie, I think that Jonathan from the Pound and Corsham has raised a really important question, which is to say, I love all this, you know, whizzy data, scatter plots, etc., but how does this actually help me sell tickets? So this is a really good question, Jonathan, and one we should definitely address. And there are a number of different ways that we can think about that, but I'm going to say that's a really great kickoff Q&A question. So I'm going to just finish up here, and then we're going to come back to that question, because I think there are quite, I mean, there are things to do with how does audience spectrum in general help us sell tickets, of course, but it's also how does the enhanced new version with all the new subsegments, how does it help us to do that better, I guess. It's one of the questions. So I'm going to throw that back. I'm going to have a stab. I'm going to throw that back at Ollie. I'm going to ask Catherine, my colleague, and indeed anybody else, some thoughts about how this might help us to do that better in future. But just quickly, before I do, I'm just going to quickly run through. Great, the segments are there. How do I get my hands on them? So obviously, if you're working with us, you can expect to be able to ask to use that extra layer. So we do work with lots of organisations in quite a hands-on way as part of our bespoke consultancy and research work. So obviously, you will find the segments are all there and available to you when you are working with us. But you'll also find that they are now in Audience Find Answers. That's the free audience data tool. If you have any, if you have ticketing data or you'd like to join our free survey, you can automatically be able to see your audience spectrum, enhanced audience spectrum profiles in the Audience Find Answers part of the application, which is the new bit. So it's not in the old graphs and charts which are under Audience Finder Original, but it will be coming soon to those parts of the program as well. But we can, if you'd like to have a look at that, you either do ask somebody in our Audience Finder team to take you through that, or if you have some questions, we can talk about that now. There's a couple of very specific questions I see coming up on you about what you've just been talking about. We'll come back to those. So just to finish off here though, so yes, you will find it in Audience Finder Answers. It'll be in some more of the graphs and charts as time goes on over the next few months. You will also find it fully integrated. You can commission an area profile report. So if you want to look at the background population of your area, you can commission that, and you will now find that all the new subsegments are in that. There are a variety of different kinds of APRs. There's a sort of very simple, straightforward one about looks at your area, just known as an area profile report. There's an area profile report plus, which gives you quite a lot of access to more background data. And then there are some specialist area profile reports, which are looking at particular kinds of audiences, and in particular, if you're trying to engage non-engaging audiences, basically. So those are known as the engagement area profile reports. So all the subsegments are all in there, and that's a really interesting tool if you want to understand better who lives in your area.
Can I just throw in
one
thing just about the enhanced version of those, is that they have the subsegment profile at the aggregate level for the area, but then where it breaks down by very particular local geography, that's done at the top level.
Okay. Great, thank you. You can also, now, if you have a nice data set and it's not already in Audience Spectrum, in Audience Finder rather, if you have a data set that you would like to have profiled, we can profile that for you so you can understand much more about who your audience overall is, who your audience for different kinds of products is, who your audience at certain times of the year are, and so on. That profiling can prove super useful. And Jonathan, that helps us to get towards, okay, great, so now what do I actually do with that? You will find it a layer in all our reporting. Ollie and his team make an awful lot of data and information freely available, lots of very specific reports. We've been working a lot on how attitudes and engagement patterns are changing post-COVID, but also how people are responding to new kinds of offers and so on. There's a very regular stream of new insights on our Evident as an Insight part of our website. So you'll find the new enhanced audience spectrum groups giving out lots of more information about how they're responding to different things at the moment. And you'll also find lots of information, particularly the new resources and so on that we'll be putting out. Do please make sure that you are in, look at our website, sign up to our newsletter, and if you're in Audience Finder, very importantly, you'll find lots of new information coming out through the Audience Finder newsletters. I think I now move on. My last slide is, so that's what there's there already. And many people already tag their all their databases on a ongoing basis with Audience Spectrum. At the moment, only the 10 profiles are available, but later on this in the autumn, you will be able to tag your database with the all new subsegments as well. There'll be a new mapping tool and dashboard within within Audience Finder Answers, but actually that will be available to everybody to go and have a look at audiences, at a map of different areas and who lives where. There will be new insights based on these segments coming out in Audience Finder Answers as well, for those of you who are Audience Finder users. And as you said, there'll be lots of interesting new stuff coming out in terms of research reports and so on. Importantly, we haven't updated some aspects of it because the new census data is going to become available available later on this year, and we were really keen not to update things until we actually had that new census data. Ollie, did you want to just mention that in particular?
Yes, but I also want to make a comment just about the insights, just to make sure for those who aren't familiar with Audience Finder answers. So the insights are essentially, it's the name for the particular thing you get, you know, a particular report or query or piece of analysis that's built into the system. So that's what those insights are. So if you've got your data, you can kind of say, show me the profile for this. In terms of the census data, obviously that will be progressively coming out in a, you know, some bits faster than others. But yes, the first bit of it should be relatively soon, and so that'll allow us to update some of the data tables particularly.